Welcome to the Bremen on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I have one piece of bad news for you. This is not a pre-game show for the Super Bowl tonight. The other day, one of our people who's involved in the Bremen, Sam Arbeser, gave me his book. He also is one of our local survivors. And I must say that my experience does not compare in a way to his experience was in terms of hardship and misery endured during these awful years. But what we all have in common is one thing, is the loss of our families, the loss of our childhood, the will to survive, and last but not least, we learn the famous words in the Mishnah, which says, Mi ani ma ani, who am I and what am I? Last week on January 27th, to be exact, we observed the 66th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And as a matter of fact, this day has been designated as Holocaust Memorial Day by the United Nations. Approximately 1 million people lived their last days on earth in this one monument to man's inhumanity to man. I did not experience the ordeal of a concentration camp. My story covers the first 6 years under Hitler's reign of terror, and later my experience as a soldier and liberator with the United States Armed Forces. But I deem it my duty to talk about the story called the Holocaust, as this is something that must be told, and if not properly disseminated, can only lead to a repetition of this kind of tragedy somewhere else, and it must be told so that future generations can learn what can happen when people blindly follow a leader who is preaching hate. This sad episode in our history taught those of us who were the source of prejudice that a whole people can be demonized and that a whole nation can be turned against a part of its society. We, the Holocaust survivors, are getting old. Our numbers continue to get smaller. And unfortunately, those who claim that this event did not happen are increasing in numbers. From the president of Iran down to lesser-known personalities, we hear denial and ridicule of the Holocaust. President Eisenhower, then General Eisenhower, when he visited the first concentration camp that was liberated, he was so incensed by what he saw that he ordered Germans from a nearby town to tour the camp to witness what had been done in their name. Then he ordered American troops to tour the camp to understand the evil that we had been fighting against. And then he invited congressmen and journalists to bear witness. And he ordered that photographs and films be made because he said, unless we document this, the world will never believe that such an atrocity could have taken place. And what Eisenhower did to record these crimes for history is what I'm attempting to do here today, but in a small way. I've been privileged to speak to schools, both here in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as in Dortmund, Germany, where I was born. And I've made one discovery. The number of 6 million is mind-boggling. It's unbelievable. And I noticed that a story of Anne Frank made such a big impact on people because to hear the story of the Holocaust through the eyes of one person seems to be much more comprehensible. It is therefore necessary to try to emphasize that each one of these 6 million people had a name, they had a face, a loved one, and a future lost. They were children, parents, they had relatives, and they're all gone. Although also, with all of the revisionists of history and Holocaust deniers, people who say the Holocaust did not happen, we, the witnesses, must speak out. When I spoke to a German high school many years ago, it was most interesting and revealing based on the types of questions that were being asked. It is evident that very little Holocaust history had been taught in German schools because, after all, it was not complementary to their fathers and to their mothers and grandparents who were probably participants in this thing. Therefore, I want to point out the importance of communication, what communication can do. Many of you remember when Steven Spielberg had a TV series called The Holocaust. It was a weekly series, it was shown all over America, and all of a sudden it was shown on German television. Only after that TV show was shown did people wake up and started asking questions. And after that TV show was shown in Germany, the Holocaust finally found a place in German history books, and it was started being taught in German schools. And I want to give you another illustration of why I think it's so important for us to speak on this. In 2005, my wife and I were on a ship on a cruise to Antarctica. And one day there was an announcement. The social director of the ship announced that he was going to have a cocktail party for all war veterans. And I've never turned down a free cocktail, neither did other war veterans. We were asked to introduce ourselves. There were people who had served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, even Desert Storm. And at that point, one man introduced himself that he had been in the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, that he became a POW, was in a prison in Canada, and stayed in Canada after World War II. We were then asked to talk about some of our experiences, and a person who preceded me was one of the people who liberated Buchenwald, the concentration camp, and he didn't mince any words to describe the horror that he had seen in this camp, how awful the conditions were, and the way the people looked. So when my turn came, I decided to talk on a similar vein because I was part of a group who liberated a freight train of Jews being shipped from one camp to another, about which I will speak a little later. As I'm telling about my experience, this German soldier gets up, stands up, and he says, "I doubt this happened." And he walked out. There's a person who designed the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, a famous architect by Peter Eisman, and he also made a comment that's very similar. He said that the Germans are very clumsy about accepting or talking about the Holocaust, and the first thing they will let you know when you mention it in those days was that my father, my grandfather had nothing to do with it, and we didn't know what was going on. But enough about generalities. I was born in Dortmund, Germany. Dortmund is a large industrial city in northwest Germany. Its claim to fame is its beer and its huge convention hall, which has hosted some of the major political and sporting events of Germany. My family considered itself very German, very patriotic. My mother had lost her first husband, 3 brothers, and a child in World War I. My father, who was my mother's second husband, had also served in World War I. He was awarded the Iron Cross, and generally my parents considered themselves very secure and very German. Following World War I, my father became a very active member of the Social Democrat Party of Germany, and as a matter of fact, He was a member of its elite section called the Reichsbanner, and he even made campaign speeches for one of the candidates for president on a Social Democrat ticket by the name of Severing. The city where my father was born, where his family lived, had the distinction of being the first town in all of Germany which deported its Jews. Needless to say that none of that part of the family survived. Economically, we were what one might call middle class. My father ran a small textile business. I can still remember January 30th, 1933. That was the day Hitler came into power. I was 10 years old and really did not comprehend what lay ahead, but I sensed the new dynamic taking place in our town. The whole tone of the community had changed, flags were flying everywhere, and more people appeared on the streets wearing Nazi uniforms. In February of 1933, the Reichstag, the German parliament, was burned down, and this was used as an excuse to disband a democratic government which had governed Germany since World War I, known as the Weimar Republic, and the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler began. Hitler used this as an excuse to begin his regime of dictatorship and terror. Interestingly enough, and the only reason I bring this up because it was a recent history, a mentally retarded young Dutchman by the name of Van der Lubbe was accused and convicted of setting the Reichstag on fire. And only in April of 2008, the current German government issued a posthumous pardon, and thereby admitting that it was a hoax, that the whole trial was a hoax, and a conviction was improper. Less than a month after Hitler came into power, the first concentration camp, Dachau to be exact, was erected. My first experience signaling a change in the political climate was the burning of books. On May 30th, 1933, citizens of our town gathered at our public square to cheer on the Nazi hoodlums as they threw pounds and pounds of books into an inferno. Books written by Jewish authors, books which may not have been on the same wavelength as the Nazi philosophy, or anything which contradicted the party line. And it's very interesting, I don't know if any of you have heard of the famous German poet Heinrich Heine. He prophesied where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings. Can you imagine it was said that long ago? Another time, walking home from school, I witnessed young German men in their brown uniforms laughing and mocking as they forced some elderly Jews to clean the streets with toothbrushes. Yes, degradation of human beings will lower their esteem and makes the job of persecution much easier to execute. During that first year in 1933, the German government enacted 42 laws restricting the rights of its Jewish citizens to earn a living, to enjoy full citizenship, or to educate themselves. Yes, the situation continued to worsen, and much of it, or most of it, with the support of the German masses. But I think the purpose today is to tell my story, so let me continue with what happened to one person, to me, and to my family. I do want to point out that each survivor's story is unique. I'm here to tell you that no two survivors have had the exact same experience during the Holocaust period, nor in their escape from this hellhole. Life for a Jewish person deteriorated rapidly. First, there was this enormous propaganda machine with anti-Semitic cartoons and newspapers and slogans on virtually every street corner of the town, instilling hatred and fear into the populace of associating with their Jewish neighbors. Boycotts against businesses and signs appearing in public places and parks saying, "No Jews allowed." This was enough to traumatize any person, let alone a young child trying to lead a normal life. Likewise, I attended a Jewish public school, which was in a fairly nice building on a large plot of land. Suddenly, we were ordered to give up the school building and move into an old abandoned school building, which was in bad shape, lacked a lot of amenities, and slowly but surely, the noose was tightening. My first personal trauma involved my father. My father commuted to a small town once a week where he had a circle of customers, and one day he did not come back. My mother and I spent hours and hours at the train station awaiting every train from that town without success. We had no word about his whereabouts for 3 whole days, and after the 3rd day, he came back. It appears that he was supposed to deliver a certain piece of textile good to a customer, and he informed the customer that he was unable to fill the order. The customer's son was present in the store. He was dressed in Nazi regalia. He kept prodding my father whether the inability to find the goods was the fault of the Nazi regime. You have to understand, saying anything against the Nazi regime was a criminal offense. My father answered in the negative. Nevertheless, this young man contacted the government, and my father was promptly arrested. 3 days later, a trial took place, and lo and behold, the father of the accuser testified on behalf of my father. I also always want to point out that there are decent people everywhere. He testified against his own son and said that in fact that my father had not made any statements against the government. The judge, who had also known my father, because my father was well known in that community, took my father aside. He says, told him this. He said, "Look, if you come back, this Nazi kid will think I didn't do anything to you. All I'm asking you to do is don't come back to this town so they think that I sent you off to a concentration camp." This was good news and bad news, because it meant abandoning a good part of his business, and from now on our financial situation went down, down, and down. At that time, we were living in a fairly nice middle-class apartment house. The wife of the owner was a new ardent member of the Nazi Party, and she decided that the building had to be free of Jews, and without notice had us evicted, and we were forced to move into a very, very substandard building just to have a roof over our head. I'm embarrassed to even tell you how substandard this building was. One day, we received a notice that one of my father's relatives had passed away in San Francisco, and that my father was one of his heirs. We were ordered to appear at the local police station, where our family had to sign some papers, and needless to say, we never saw the inheritance. In my 73 years in the United States, I've never been able to find out who these relatives might have been. In spite of my interest in Jewish genealogy, I've not made any headway. Sensing that the situation was worsening, my parents applied for visas for me to immigrate anywhere, to Palestine, to New Zealand, or the US. At that time, I was 14 years old. In March of 1938, the Germans invaded Austria, and sensing that a world war was imminent, the US government suddenly announced that it would issue visas to approximately 1,200 children. A social worker in our town called my parents and told them that they could get me a visa to the United States. But I had to be packed and ready to leave in 24 hours. This meant 24 hours to get used to the idea of leaving my parents, deciding which belongings to pack, and say my goodbyes. We quickly packed my belongings, and lo and behold, the night before my scheduled departure, I ran a very high fever. And knowing that the US consul would not issue a visa with one with fever, my mother packed me with cold compresses all night, and like a miracle, when morning came, my fever was gone. I must tell you, the scene of my departure is something that will forever be embedded in my mind. We walked to the train station. Yes, we walked, as we were no longer permitted to use public transportation. We carried our luggage and took the long walk. My parents put me on a train, and I quickly went to the window for a last look. I never will forget the faces of my parents as they stood on the platform as the train pulled out. As they got smaller and smaller, at this stage of my life, I believe they knew we would never meet again. About 2 years ago, a book was published full of accounts of children who had left Germany in the same manner as I did. I was taken aback that all of them mentioned that same experience and emotion of their respective departures at the train station. And I assume, because of this similarity, the book was appropriately entitled, Don't Wave Goodbye. Arriving at the United States for a 14-year-old was the most exciting event. In spite of my age, I was overwhelmed. I'd read so much about America, and when we passed the Statue of Liberty, it was an unbelievable emotional experience for me. And I earlier mentioned the fact that so many people in this book mentioned their departure at the German railway station. The emotion of this passing the Statue of Liberty likewise became an important part of most of these stories. For a person leaving oppression and entering this beautiful country, you cannot believe what this lady looks like. Prettier, more beautiful than Miss America. I was met by a social worker, and after a night in New York, we were off to Birmingham, Alabama, as my visa had been sponsored by the Birmingham section of the National Council of Jewish Women. When we got to Washington, D.C., I noticed a lot of stirring on the train, people moving in different directions. I didn't speak much any English, really. The social worker tried to explain to me the Jim Crow laws as we were crossing the Mason-Dixon line. He drew me a diagram, but honestly, I did not understand what he tried to tell me for several years. This was my introduction to the South and to segregation. I had left one injustice to witness another injustice, the segregation between blacks and whites. Being the first refugee in Alabama, I quickly became a sensation. And in spite of my difficulties with the English language, I was invited virtually every Sunday to various churches in Birmingham to speak to their Sunday schools. I was placed in the 6th grade of an elementary school. Every 2 weeks I was promoted to a higher grade, attended summer school, and entered high school as a sophomore in the fall. But this high school required that I take a foreign language, and I couldn't speak English yet. So I opted for Spanish. So every night when I came home and looked at my homework, I would translate the words from Spanish to German to English and back and forth until I understood what was going on, and P.S. I passed. Later that year, I learned that my father had gotten killed on Kristallnacht. Unfortunately, I did not learn all of the details of his death until some 50 years later. Kristallnacht was Germany's first serious action against its Jewish citizens. In an organized fashion in every town in Germany, mobs lashed out against its Jewish population, while the police and fire department just stood by and watched. Just compare this to the heroism of the firemen policemen at 9/11. And the only reason I mention 9/11, because if you turn this around, Kristallnacht was on 11/9. Store windows of Jewish shop owners were broken into. The stores were looted and nearly all synagogues were burned. According to a British eyewitness, terrified children were turned sobbing out of their beds, which were then smashed to pieces. Hitler was encouraged when he realized that the world stood by, watched, and did nothing. Kristallnacht was a turning point of how Nazism was perceived. It was a culmination of more than 5 years and 9 months of discrimination, persecution, and a prelude to the destruction of a whole people, and an indication of what can happen when society falls victim to its basest instincts. At the close of World War II, the Allies pressured the German government to pay restitution to the Holocaust victims and their families for losses of life, health, and property. I filed a claim for my father's life with the German government. All of the claims were based on information I had gathered from my family, and they were all rejected with the comment that my claim was not true. In other words, I was a liar. This was in post-war Germany. The court even produced a death certificate which listed the cause of death as heart failure, which had become a very common way to do it. As I said, 50 years later, but too late, I found all the evidence that the stories I'd been told were correct and that my father was indeed a victim of Kristallnacht. The building where my father had been incarcerated had been turned into a Holocaust museum, and it contains archives of all the events which took place in this hell of a building. One thing that I always like to emphasize, that the Germans documented all this stuff instead of being embarrassed about it. Every action they took was documented. I once went to an archive in Berlin and checking on some of my uncles and aunts, and I was shocked out of my mind when it showed what day they were picked up, which transport number took them, where they were changed to a train, when they got off the train. I mean, the entire schedule in fine detail was in these books. Well, it seems that I had filed a claim on behalf of Edmund Birnbrey, my father's name, and the court advised me that there was no record of an Edmund Birnbrey hadn't been an inmate in a Gestapo prison. 50 years later, I went through the archive and I discovered a document which spelled his name B-I-R-E-N-B-R-E-Y instead of B-I-R-N-B-R-E-Y. And it seems that the court, in its wisdom, used this as an excuse that nobody by the name that I claimed had been in this place. Interesting enough, the home address matched, his date of birth matched, everything matched, except the insertion of the letter E in his last name. In June of 2009, I visited his place with some of my children and grandchildren, And as we entered the torture chamber of this museum, I suffered a heart attack. I still had in my possession letters from my mother who desperately tried to get a visa to anywhere, actually to countries that I had never heard of. What is generally unknown today is that many lives could have been saved if only they could have gotten visas to other countries. At that time, there was no problem getting out of Germany. The problem was getting into other countries. As a further act of degradation and harassment, on August 17, 1938, a law was handed down that every Jewish man had to add the name Israel, and every woman had to add the name Sarah to their respective names. My mother passed away shortly after that law was passed, and I found myself completely alone. I want to digress a minute. We often hear that people didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what was going on. Things would have been different. In 1940, I was elected to be a delegate to the National Red Cross Convention from Atlanta and Fulton County. I went to this convention, and social worker after social worker had gotten up and talked about the German invasion of Poland, how they killed innocent people, how they bombed cities, strafed people on the highways. All of the bad things that the Germans were doing in Poland were discussed in Washington, D.C. at the National Red Cross Convention. I heard it, and we say we didn't know what was going on. I entered the United States as a refugee, but with a German passport. My passport is in a museum, if you care to see it. It's in one of the cases. When World War II began, because of security concerns, all of the residents who held either a German or Japanese passport were classified as enemy aliens. And as a result, I had to go to the post office once a month to report. This made me ineligible to join the U.S. Armed Forces, and since I was most anxious to get involved, I filed a presidential appeal, and in June 1943, I was privileged to join the U.S. Army. Thus, during World War II, I returned to Germany as a soldier in the U.S. Army, and I even took part in the Normandy invasion forces landing on Omaha Beach. Towards the end of the war, on April 13, 1945 to be exact, I had become a forward observer for the artillery, and in searching for gun positions near the town of Farsleben, which is about, if you're familiar with Germany, a few kilometers from Magdeburg, we sensed a terrible odor, a terrible stink. We didn't know what it was. We looked for the source of this odor, and we suddenly found ourselves in front of an abandoned freight train full of Jewish people being moved from Bergen-Belsen to Theresienstadt to prevent the advancing Allied armies from seeing the condition of these living skeletons. This train contained approximately 2,500 Jews, 25% of them children. When it became obvious that the train could no longer make the trip to Theresienstadt, the engineer was ordered to return the train to a bridge crossing the Elbe River and blow it up. The sight of these poor people is something that can never be erased from our mind. They'd been locked in these antiquated freight cars, which during any of you American Legion people, which during World War I were referred to as 40s and 8s, signifying that these cars could hold either 40 men or 8 horses. Now they were carrying about 70 people in one car, packed like sardines, standing room only, no food, little water, and certainly no sanitary facilities. They were in the most subhuman state. They were the living human skeletons. Some were dead, some were so bewildered that they did not resemble human beings. It was truly an embarrassment to civilization. But here, I always feel like I have to correct myself, because these people were the human beings. It was the people who put them in these cars who were not the human beings. I felt very helpless that day. I had nothing to share with them. I was on a reconnaissance mission, carried no food, and had barely one canteen full of water. There was nothing I could give them. These people had been locked in these cars for several days without food and water, and one of our medical officers took it on himself to evacuate a village, a German village, made all the inhabitants get out and turned it into a field hospital to help these poor people. For years I've been speaking about this event, I've been wondering about these people, but never, changed what I just said. Lo and behold, I belong to the 30th Infantry Division Association, and two of the members of that association suddenly got concerned. What happened to these people? So they went actively searched for the survivors of this train, and in 2008, they located 5 families, one as far as from London, England, and brought them to the convention, to the reunion. They were really witnesses of the Holocaust. 2 weeks later, as we neared the town of Magdeburg, once again, we passed miles and miles of ditches of dead bodies. We were told that as the Russians were advancing, this group was on a forced march from one concentration camp to another, and once again, because the American army was advancing from the other side, the Germans, rather than let these poor people be liberated, shot them and left them dead along the highway. In conclusion, just as I mentioned earlier, the number 6 million is incomprehensible, and it's also incomprehensible as mass murder and uncivilized behavior was the deed of just a few people. Since so few stood up to decry this barbarism, what took place had to take place with the active or passive support of the great majority of Germans. I do mean the great majority, but I will never say all, as one should never generalize. No society in this world is all good or all bad. As an example, to this day I'm still in touch with a number of righteous families who stood with us and supported us. The Holocaust could not have occurred if the Nazis had not succeeded in purging the German legal system of its honorable lawyers and judges. They had to intimidate and silence newspaper reporters and turn the national media into vehicles of propaganda and mindless entertainment. The Nazis seized upon ongoing international tensions and used propaganda to inflate them into threats. Then they obliged Germans to prove their patriotism by supporting cruel, ill-considered wars that could not be won. Soldiers were ordered to violate the Geneva Conventions, and officers who protested this breach were marginalized or abruptly retired. Let me sum up by quoting a statement made by an unknown Holocaust survivor. He asked, "At Auschwitz, where was God?" And the answer that was given, where was man? This is an important lesson as we stand by while inhumanity and genocide is still taking place in the world today. Just look at today's suicide bombers, the situation in Darfur, Sudan. As Elie Wiesel said, silence encourages the tormentor. My experience can be summed up in a famous saying, "He who saved one life, it is as if he saved in the entire world. My life was saved. I have 4 wonderful children, 15 beautiful grandchildren, and 6 even more beautiful great-grandchildren. Thank you very much for your attention, and let me share this with you, and I will be more than glad to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. That is from my passport photo. Are you clicking it? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying.
That's a picture of my original passport photo when I came over.
I'm sorry.
That's a map of Germany, just showing where I came from Germany to Atlanta. Actually, from Germany to Birmingham to Atlanta. And what's next?
Okay.
This shows the white area when was Germany controlled after on March 15, 1939. They had entered Czechoslovakia and Austria, and of course East Prussia was always German, and they did not enter Poland until September of 39. Go ahead. And you see Dortmund, it's in northwest Germany, and if you look to the right, there's this town Magdeburg, which I described where they found a freight train. And incidentally, in Magdeburg, under the Potsdam Agreement, that was as far as the American army went. The Elbe River was a divide between the Soviets and American forces. Actually, my outfit was supposed to march into Berlin, but because of the Potsdam Agreement, we stopped at the Elbe River. There's my passport picture. That was my father and mother. And as you notice, when I was 14 years old, although I'm not a tall person today, I was a little bit taller than they were at that age already. This was me coming over on the ship. We came on a German cruise ship, and because they wanted to make an impression on the international passengers they had, I want you to know that we were treated like first-class people and not the way you usually visualize refugees on a ship. They didn't want any impression that the Nazis weren't nice people. This is my family, and a lot of them are here today. That was sort of a command performance. But this was. And I say always, this is what slogan I had, always participate in the community to help make this world and society a better place to live in. It's my motto. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes. He asked me about my current family, or I guess. I was taken in by a foster parent in Atlanta, and I moved to Atlanta in January '39, and this family had really taken me in. I'm an uncle and a cousin and a brother and a sister to all of them. They've included me in all family functions, and with all due respect to Virginia Saul, who's here, at one time, this family was considered the largest Jewish family in Atlanta.